At 2:15 in the morning on September 11th, 2019, the Marion County Sheriff's Office received a call that would launch one of the most disturbing cases in their history. The voice on the other end belonged to Sheldon Alleyne, and his words were heavy with desperation and fear. "We need someone to check on my daughter," he told the dispatcher, his voice trembling. "Something's happened to my daughter." The dispatcher immediately sensed the urgency in his tone. This wasn't a routine wellness check request from a worried parent who hadn't heard from their child in a few days. This was something else entirely. Something that had shaken a father to his core in the middle of the night. "What makes you think something's wrong?" the dispatcher asked, trying to gather more information. But Sheldon couldn't bring himself to explain the full horror of what he had just witnessed. How could he possibly describe what had just been shown to him? How could he put into words the nightmare that had unfolded on his phone screen just moments before? "Please," he pleaded. "Just send someone to 2241 NE 78th Lane in Anthony. Please hurry." Within minutes, patrol units were racing through the dark streets of Marion County toward the small community of Anthony, just north of Ocala. The address led them to a modest home on a quiet residential street, where 20-year-old Kiara Alleyne lived with her 11-month-old daughter, Janae. As the first deputies arrived at the scene, they approached the house with caution. The exterior appeared normal. No obvious signs of disturbance, no broken windows, no indication that anything was amiss. But the urgency in that father's voice told them otherwise. The front door was unlocked. As they stepped inside, the deputies immediately knew they were walking into a crime scene. The smell hit them first. A strong odor of lighter fluid hung thick in the air. Their flashlights revealed evidence of a struggle, overturned furniture, and something that made their hearts sink. There, on the floor of her own home, was Kiara Alleyne. The young mother was dead, the victim of what appeared to be a violent stabbing. But this wasn't just a murder scene. Someone had tried to destroy the evidence. Investigators quickly discovered a blanket stuffed underneath the kitchen oven, soaked with what appeared to be lighter fluid or another accelerant. Someone had attempted to burn down the house, presumably to cover their tracks. Fortunately, the arson attempt had failed, leaving crucial evidence intact. But as deputies secured the scene and began their initial investigation, they realized this case was about to become even more complex. Kiara's 11-month-old daughter was nowhere to be found. Neither was Deangelo Clark, the baby's father and Kiara's boyfriend. The implications were immediate and terrifying. Not only were they dealing with a brutal murder, but a baby was missing, potentially in the hands of the killer. Within hours, an Amber Alert was issued across Florida. The alert described 11-month-old Janae Clark as being in extreme danger, last seen with 30-year-old Deangelo Clark, who was now the prime suspect in her mother's murder. The description went out over radio waves, television broadcasts, and digital highway signs across the state. A dangerous man was on the run with an infant child. Every law enforcement agency in Florida was now on high alert, searching for a killer who had taken his own daughter as he fled. But what had prompted that desperate 2:15 a.m. phone call from Sheldon Alleyne? What had he seen that made him so certain something terrible had happened to his daughter? The answer to that question would prove to be more disturbing than investigators could have imagined. As the sun rose on September 11, 2019, detectives were just beginning to piece together the events that had led to Kiara's death. They had a crime scene, they had a suspect, and they had a missing baby. But they were still missing the most crucial piece of the puzzle, the horrifying catalyst that had set everything in motion. What they would soon discover would reveal not just a murder but an act of psychological cruelty so profound that it would haunt everyone involved in the case. Before we continue with Kiara's story, we want to hear from you. Comment below and let us know where you're watching from. And tell us, do you think domestic violence gets enough attention in our communities? Your engagement helps us bring awareness to these critical issues. To understand the tragedy that unfolded, we need to know who Kiara Alleyne really was. Not just as a victim, but as a person, a daughter, and most importantly, a mother. At just 20 years old, Kiara had already embraced the most important role of her life, being a mom to her 11-month-old daughter, Janae. Those who knew her described a young woman whose entire world revolved around her baby girl. Every decision she made, every plan she had for the future, centered on providing the best life possible for Janae. Kiara lived in Anthony, a small tight-knit community in Marion County, Florida, just north of Ocala. It's the kind of place where neighbors know each other by name, where people wave when they pass on the street, and where news travels fast. Anthony isn't a place where you expect to hear about violent crime. It's a community where families raise their children, and where everyone looks out for one another. Her neighbor Maria Kimball would later reflect on the young couple she had observed over the months. "She was a beautiful young lady," Maria would say, shaking her head in disbelief. When asked about Kiara and Deangelo together, Maria's observation was telling: they seemed happy. This observation would prove to be one of the most important aspects of understanding domestic violence, how it can remain completely hidden from the outside world. To their neighbors, to casual observers, Kiara and Deangelo appeared to be just another young couple navigating the challenges of parenthood together. Deangelo Clark was 30 years old, a full decade older than Kiara. He was Janae's father, and the two had been together for approximately 2 years. To anyone looking from the outside, they might have appeared to be a typical family unit, a young mother, an older boyfriend, and their precious baby daughter. But age gaps in relationships, especially when one partner is barely out of their teens, can create complex power dynamics that aren't always visible to outsiders. At 18, when their relationship likely began, Kiara was just entering adulthood, while Deangelo was already an established adult with nearly 3 decades of life experience. For Kiara, motherhood had become her identity in the most beautiful way. Friends and family members would describe how she lit up when talking about Janae's milestones, her first smile, her attempts at crawling, the way she would babble and reach for her mother. Kiara documented these precious moments, treasuring each day as her daughter grew and developed. The young mother had dreams and aspirations beyond just the day-to-day routine of caring for an infant. Like many mothers her age, she was learning to balance her own growth and development with the overwhelming responsibility of raising another human being. It's a challenge that requires immense strength, maturity, and support. In Anthony, Kiara had built a life that seemed peaceful and promising. The community offered the kind of environment where she could raise Janae safely, surrounded by neighbors who cared, and in a place where a child could grow up knowing the value of community and connection. What made Kiara's situation particularly complex was how normal everything appeared on the surface. There were no obvious red flags that neighbors could point to, no dramatic arguments that spilled into the street, no visible signs that would have raised immediate alarm bells in the community. This is one of the most insidious aspects of domestic relationships that turn violent. They often exist behind closed doors, hidden from friends, family, and neighbors who might otherwise intervene. The abuser becomes skilled at maintaining a public persona that contradicts their private behavior, leaving victims isolated and without obvious sources of help. Maria Kimball's recollection that the couple seemed happy speaks to this reality. From her vantage point as a neighbor, there was nothing that would have suggested the darkness that was actually developing within their relationship. Kiara appeared to be a devoted mother, Deangelo seemed to be a present father, and baby Janae was clearly loved and cared for. But behind the closed doors of their shared home, a very different story was beginning to unfold, one that would soon shatter the peace of this quiet community and reveal the devastating reality that Kiara had been living with. While the outside world saw what appeared to be a happy young family, the reality inside Kiara and Deangelo's relationship was far more complicated. Over their 2 years together, their dynamic had been anything but stable. Those close to the situation would later describe their relationship as tumultuous, a word that barely scratches the surface of what Kiara was actually experiencing. The first concrete evidence that something was seriously wrong came on June 7, 2019, just 3 months before Kiara's death. On that day, Marion County Sheriff's deputies received a call that brought them to the couple's home on NE 78th Lane. The details of that first incident remained largely private, but it marked the beginning of an official paper trail documenting trouble in their relationship. 12 days later, on June 19, 2019, deputies found themselves returning to the same address. This time, the situation was more serious. This time, Kiara herself was the one making the report. During that second visit, Kiara told the responding officers something that should have sent alarm bells throughout the entire system. Deangelo had threatened to kill her. But it wasn't just a threat against her life, he had also threatened to take his own life as well. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment argument or a lover's quarrel that had gotten out of hand. This was a direct, explicit threat of murder-suicide. Kiara was doing exactly what domestic violence experts tell victims to do. She was reporting the threats to law enforcement. She was reaching out for help before the situation escalated further. She was trying to protect herself and, by extension, her baby daughter. But despite Kiara's courage in coming forward, despite her direct plea for help, and despite the seriousness of the threats being reported, no arrests were made that day. The deputies conducted their follow-up. They documented the incident, but ultimately determined there was insufficient evidence to take Deangelo into custody. This decision would prove to be one of the most tragic aspects of Kiara's case. Here was a young mother, actively seeking help from the very system designed to protect her, and that system failed to recognize the deadly seriousness of her situation. The challenge of domestic violence cases for law enforcement is real and complex. Often by the time police arrive, the immediate threat has passed. Physical evidence may be limited, witnesses are rare, and sometimes, victims themselves become reluctant to proceed with charges due to fear, financial dependence, or psychological manipulation by their abuser. But Kiara wasn't reluctant. She was actively reporting threats against her life. She was asking for help. And she was told, essentially, that what she was experiencing wasn't enough to warrant intervention. What made Deangelo's behavior even more manipulative was how he presented himself publicly. On social media, he would post declarations of love for Kiara, sharing photos of their family and writing captions that painted him as a devoted boyfriend and father. To anyone scrolling through his Facebook feed, he appeared to be a man deeply in love with his girlfriend and committed to their family. This dual personality, threatening violence in private while projecting love in public, is a classic pattern in abusive relationships. It serves multiple purposes. It confuses the victim about the reality of their situation. It provides the abuser with character witnesses who can point to his loving posts if questioned, and it maintains the public image that keeps friends and family from intervening. For Kiara, this created an impossible situation. Who would believe that the man posting loving tributes to her online was the same person threatening to kill her behind closed doors? How could she convince others that her life was in danger when all the evidence publicly available suggested the opposite? The psychological trap that domestic violence creates is intricate and powerful. Victims often find themselves questioning their own perceptions, wondering if they're overreacting or believing that they somehow deserve the treatment they're receiving. When the abuser alternates between threats and declarations of love, it creates a cycle that becomes increasingly difficult to escape. As the summer of 2019 progressed, Kiara continued living with a man who had explicitly threatened her life. The system that should have protected her had failed to act on her reports. Her neighbors continued to see what appeared to be a happy family. And Deangelo continued his pattern of private threats masked by public displays of affection. None of them knew that they were watching the final months of Kiara Alleyne's life unfold. September 11th, 2019 began like countless other days in the Alleyne Clark household. Kiara woke up to tend to baby Janae, going through the familiar routine of diaper changes, feedings, and the gentle chaos that comes with caring for an 11-month-old. There was no way she could have known that this ordinary Wednesday would be her last day on Earth. The exact timeline of events leading up to the tragedy remains largely unknown. What we do know is that at some point during the day, the underlying tension that had been building in their relationship for months finally reached its breaking point. By evening, something had gone terribly wrong inside the home on NE 78th Lane. The attack itself was swift and brutal. Kiara was stabbed multiple times inside her own home, the very place where she should have felt safest, where she was raising her daughter, where she had tried to build a life for her family. The violence occurred in the space where baby Janae took her first steps, where family photos lined the walls, where normal life had continued despite the growing danger. But Deangelo's actions immediately after the stabbing revealed a calculated mindset that went far beyond a moment of rage. Rather than calling for help, rather than showing any remorse for what he had done, he began systematically attempting to destroy the evidence of his crime. He moved through the house with purpose, gathering materials to stage what he hoped would look like an accidental fire. He soaked a blanket with lighter fluid, the pungent smell filling the air as he prepared to burn down the home where he had just committed murder. His plan was simple. If the house burned, there would be no crime scene, no evidence, and potentially no way to prove what he had done. He stuffed the accelerant-soaked blanket underneath the kitchen oven, positioning it where he believed the flames would catch and spread throughout the structure. In his mind, the fire would consume everything: Kiara's body, any physical evidence of the stabbing, and any trace of his involvement in her death. But arson, like murder, requires more than just intent. The fire failed to ignite properly, leaving behind crucial evidence that would later prove his guilt. The strong odor of lighter fluid would greet the first deputies on scene, and the placement of the blanket would clearly indicate an intentional attempt at arson. With his plan to destroy the evidence unsuccessful, Deangelo made a decision that would turn this from a local murder case into a statewide manhunt. He gathered up 11-month-old Jenny and fled the scene, taking his own daughter as he escaped. If you want us to continue covering cases that bring awareness to domestic violence and help protect potential victims, please like this video. Your support helps us reach more people with these important stories. The moment Deangelo left that house with Jenny, he transformed from a murder suspect into something even more dangerous: a kidnapper with nothing left to lose. The baby, who had already lost her mother to violence, was now in the hands of the man who had killed her. Within hours, law enforcement agencies across Florida were mobilized in one of the most urgent searches in recent memory. This wasn't just about apprehending a murder suspect. This was about saving an innocent child who was potentially in mortal danger. The Amber Alert that went out across the state painted a stark picture: a 30-year-old man, armed and dangerous, on the run with an 11-month-old baby after allegedly murdering the child's mother. Every police officer, every highway patrol unit, every sheriff's deputy in Florida was now looking for Deangelo Clark's vehicle. But Deangelo wasn't just running randomly. He had a destination in mind, and he was willing to drive hundreds of miles to reach it. His flight would take him through multiple counties, past countless opportunities to surrender, past exit after exit where he could have stopped and turned himself in. Instead, he kept driving south, deeper into Florida, taking baby Jenny farther and farther away from any family members who might be able to care for her. With each mile he traveled, the danger to the child increased, and the urgency of the search intensified. What law enforcement didn't yet know was that the most disturbing aspect of this case wasn't even the murder itself. It was what had prompted that desperate 2:15 a.m. phone call from Kiara's father. The truth behind that call would soon reveal a level of cruelty that none of them were prepared for. Now we come to the most disturbing part of this case: the truth behind what prompted Sheldon Alleyne's desperate 2:15 a.m. call to police. What happened in those crucial moments before he picked up the phone would reveal a level of psychological cruelty that went far beyond the physical act of murder. At some point after stabbing Kiara, while she lay dying on the floor of her own home, Deangelo Clark made a decision that would haunt her father for the rest of his life. He picked up his phone and initiated a FaceTime call to Sheldon Alleyne. This wasn't a call to confess. This wasn't a call asking for help. This was something far more twisted. When Sheldon answered his phone that night, expecting perhaps a normal conversation with his daughter's boyfriend, he was instead confronted with a scene of unimaginable horror. There, on his phone screen, was his 20-year-old daughter lying motionless on the floor, surrounded by a pool of her own blood. "I killed your daughter," Clark told him, his voice carrying across the phone line as Sheldon stared at the nightmare unfolding on his screen. The psychological impact of this moment cannot be overstated. Sheldon wasn't just learning about his daughter's death through a phone call or a visit from police. He was being forced to witness her final moments, to see her dying body, to experience her murder in real time through the calculated cruelty of her killer. But Clark wasn't finished with his psychological torture. "What should I do?" he asked Sheldon, as if seeking advice from the father of the woman he had just murdered. Sheldon, desperate and hoping against hope that his daughter might still be saved, urged Clark to call for help. Maybe paramedics could still save her. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe this nightmare could somehow be reversed. But Clark's response revealed the true depth of his selfishness and calculation. "I can't because they will take the baby." Even in this moment of ultimate crisis, even after committing murder, Clark's primary concern wasn't for Kiara's life or for getting her medical attention. His concern was for himself and maintaining control over Janae. He had already decided that he would rather let Kiara die than face the consequences of his actions. This FaceTime call represents one of the most psychologically cruel aspects of the entire case. Clark could have simply fled after the murder. He could have called 911 himself. He could have tried to cover up his crime without involving anyone else. Instead, he chose to inflict maximum emotional damage on Kiara's father, forcing him to become an unwilling witness to his daughter's final moments. The call ended, leaving Sheldon with images seared into his memory that no parent should ever have to see. It was only then that he called 911, requesting the wellness check that would lead deputies to discover Kiara's body. But Clark was already miles away, driving south through the Florida night with baby Janae in his vehicle. His destination was nearly 400 miles away, the Florida Keys, where he apparently believed he could disappear or make his final stand. The drive took him through multiple counties, past numerous police jurisdictions, all while law enforcement agencies across the state were mobilizing to find him. Highway patrol officers were stationed at major intersections, local police were checking motels and gas stations, and the Amber Alert was broadcasting his description to millions of Floridians. But Clark made it to the Keys, arriving in what many consider to be one of Florida's most beautiful and peaceful destinations. The irony wasn't lost on investigators. A man who had just committed one of the most heinous crimes imaginable was now in a place known for its tranquil waters and laid-back atmosphere. Once in the Keys, Clark's behavior became increasingly erratic and destructive. On Long Key, he broke into someone's home, an act that was captured on surveillance cameras. The footage would later help authorities track his movements and confirm his presence in the area. But it was on Grassy Key where Clark's flight would come to a dramatic and self-destructive end. In what appeared to be either a suicide attempt or a final act of destruction, he doused his Mazda CX-7 with accelerant and set it ablaze. The flames that engulfed his vehicle quickly spread to a nearby stilted home, creating a dangerous situation for other residents and property. But Clark had miscalculated the intensity of the fire he had started. The flames didn't just destroy his car, they severely burned his arms and hands, leaving him screaming in agony. A 911 call came in reporting a man yelling that his car had exploded and that he was badly burned. When first responders arrived, they found Clark with burns so severe that he required immediate medical evacuation to a Miami hospital. The very method he had chosen to potentially end his life had instead led to his capture. Baby Janae, meanwhile, had been found safe with family members, finally out of danger and away from the man who had killed her mother. Clark's month-long hospitalization would give investigators time to build their case, but it would also mean that justice for Kiara would have to wait. While Deangelo Clark lay hospitalized with severe burns from his self-inflicted injuries, there was at least one piece of good news emerging from this tragedy. Baby Janae had been found safe. Thanks to the swift response of law enforcement and the effectiveness of the Amber Alert system, the 11-month-old was located with family members who could provide her with the love and care she desperately needed. For a child who had lost her mother to violence and been taken on a terrifying journey by her father, Janae's safety represented the only bright spot in an otherwise devastating case. She would now grow up without her mother, but at least she would grow up surrounded by family members who loved her and could help her heal from this trauma. After spending nearly a month recovering from his burns in a Miami hospital, Clark was finally well enough to be transported back to Marion County to face justice for his crimes. When he arrived at the Marion County Jail, he was formally charged with homicide and first-degree arson, charges that carried the potential for life in prison. The legal process that followed would span several years, as is often the case with serious felony charges. Court proceedings, plea negotiations, trial preparation, and various legal motions all contributed to a lengthy timeline that extended the suffering for Kiara's family, who were desperate for closure and justice. Throughout this process, Sheldon Alleyne had to live with the traumatic memories of that horrific FaceTime call. Every day, he carried the burden of having witnessed his daughter's final moments in such a cruel and calculated manner. The psychological impact of what Clark had forced him to see would require ongoing support and counseling, adding another layer of victimization to an already devastating crime. The legal system eventually delivered the justice that Kiara's family had been waiting for. Clark was convicted of murder, bringing a measure of accountability for his actions. However, like many defendants in serious criminal cases, he chose to appeal his conviction, prolonging the legal process even further. On January 7, 2025, more than 5 years after Kiara's murder, the Florida 5th District Court of Appeal issued their final decision on Clark's appeal. In the case of Deangelo Leandrew Shelton Clark v. State of Florida, the higher court affirmed his conviction, meaning that his guilty verdict would stand and his legal options had been exhausted. This affirmation represented the final chapter in the legal proceedings, but it also highlighted how the justice system can sometimes move frustratingly slowly for families seeking closure. 5.5 years is a long time to wait for finality when you're grieving the loss of a loved one. Before we finish Kiara's story, we want to ask you to subscribe to our channel and share this video. Raising awareness about domestic violence could help save someone's life, and your engagement helps us reach more people with these critical stories. The case of Kiara Alleyne serves as a powerful reminder of how domestic violence can escalate to deadly consequences, even when victims try to seek help through proper channels. Her reports to law enforcement in June 2019 represented exactly the kind of proactive steps that domestic violence experts encourage victims to take, yet the system's response was insufficient to prevent the ultimate tragedy. For families dealing with domestic violence situations, Kiara's story underscores the importance of having safety plans in place and understanding that leaving an abusive relationship can actually be the most dangerous time for victims. Organizations like the National Domestic Violence Hotline provide 24/7 support and can help create safety strategies tailored to individual situations. The community of Anthony, Florida was forever changed by this tragedy. Neighbors who had thought they knew the young couple living on NE 78th Lane were forced to confront the reality that domestic violence can exist anywhere, even in relationships that appear normal from the outside. Baby Janae, now several years older, faces the challenge of growing up without her mother while being raised by family members who love her. While she's too young to understand what happened, she will eventually need age-appropriate explanations about her mother's death and ongoing support to process this trauma. Kiara Alleyne's legacy extends beyond the tragedy of her death. Her story has become part of the broader conversation about domestic violence prevention, the need for better intervention strategies, and the importance of believing victims when they report threats. Her life mattered, her dreams mattered, and her death serves as a call to action for all of us to do better in protecting vulnerable individuals from those who would harm them. Though her time was cut tragically short, Kiara's memory lives on through her daughter and through every person who learns from her story and takes action to prevent similar tragedies in their own communities.